The Bible has a history that goes beyond the completion of the canon. It goes into the present day. When we read our Bibles, we have a certain concept of what the Bible is. And within this series, I want us to think about what, in fact, the Bible as a book is, and then how we might change our forms of engagement with it if we think about it differently. The Bible, in its original form, was a series of scriptures, not necessarily held together between any binding. It was only later on within the history of the church that the Bible became a sort of pandect, a collection of all these different texts and scriptures between two covers. For most of the period of the early church, the prominent form of biblical text was the Codex. It was a form of the modern book bound between two covers, and they would have engaged the scriptures in a number of different codexes or codices that would have bound specific scriptures. Perhaps one with the works of Paul, one with a gospel, and various texts like this which would be a lot more portable than others, cheaper to produce, and became the preferred form of text for many of the people within the early church, even if it was not the dominant form within the wider culture at that time. Later history led to different forms of text. If we think about, for instance, the medieval text of the scriptures, it's the creation of a number of different developments. Developments in formatting. We can think about the way that things like chapter breaks were only in their modern form developed with Archbishop Stephen Langton in the 13th century, and the divisions in text before that were mostly just for reading purposes, where there would be some passage breaks within the lections. Beyond this, we can see a later development in the 1500s of verses in their current form. And all of these things lead to different forms of engagement. The modern Bible is also the creation of things like movable text and the printing press. We think about the work of Gutenberg in this regard, and the way in which his innovation led to a text that could be printed and disseminated far more easily. And so, after the period of 100 years had elapsed after Gutenberg, Bibles were able to be produced in far greater quantity at far less cost and were able to be spread throughout Europe. Now, these sorts of developments often occurred in stages, and many of these things were anticipated beforehand in previous forms of textual engagement. Already in the later Middle Ages, we can see developments in the forms that texts were designed to be encountered. Texts were increasingly written not for reading aloud, but for silent reading, for private study, to navigate and find things more quickly. And we can see this in some of the marginalia, the various other resources that would come with texts, the ways in which they'd be divided into chapters and verses, and made navigable for the reader. In the past, there was not necessarily even spaces between the words of biblical texts. They were designed to be read aloud, and so the reader was someone who would be performing the text and presumably practicing for a while before they did so. Many of our texts in the modern age are designed to be read and digested quickly, and so we're not used to the sort of slow, deliberate public reading of texts that would have been normal in the past. We can also easily forget how great the size of our collections of books are relative to those of the past. In the past, a large library might contain no more than a couple of hundred volumes, and many of our libraries now contain thousands, just our personal libraries. And so, when we consider the reading of the scriptures, you could take time over it. There was the expectation you would not be hurrying through it, and many texts were written with that in mind. A recognition that you can't just read a text like that. You have to labor over it, meditate upon it, and spend time with it. And the scriptures being designed for those sorts of reading, not just the private scholarly reading that can often be common for us, and the private study of the text with the personal Bible, it invited certain forms of engagement. It was written and produced for certain forms of engagement. These texts were costly too. We can easily forget that even Gutenberg's original Bibles would take the equivalent of about 170 or 180 calf skins to produce a single text on vellum, or that would be the equivalent of around 300 sheepskins. It's a very costly thing to produce. Later developments would lead to paper that could be cheaply created. Already in the 14th century, the development of new forms of paper production with used textiles enabled cheaper paper to be produced and cheaper books as a result. As we go through the history of the church, there were further developments that enabled the text to spread even wider. Part of these were developments in education, general literacy, enabling people to read their own personal Bibles. You can think also of things like the steam printing press. The former printing presses could not operate on quite the same level as the steam printing press, which could churn out texts in a very rapid period of time. It was not until the later 19th century that the sort of India paper that we use for our Bibles, a thin paper, was developed. Before that, it was on other forms of paper. And by the modern age, we have digital Bibles and online Bibles that can be searched through, and they're navigable in a new form of way. Now, when we consider these forms of texts, the ways in which the book invites certain forms of reading and engagement, we might begin to see how much it matters the sorts of habits of engagement with the Scriptures that we are inviting and developing and forming ourselves within. And so within this series, I want us to think more carefully about the ways that we engage with the Scriptures, how that shapes the way that we understand what the Scriptures are, and how the church, through understanding the Bible, what sort of book it is, can be formed to be the sort of people that it is supposed to be.